Well, Doug, thanks for that. I think it's probably obvious to say that those images bring poignancy, but also barely scratch the surface of what you discuss in the book. One thing, I have so many questions, and I hope I can get to at least some of them. One thing that kept striking me, and it really came up, especially with those examples you chose in non-first world cities, for the most part, is the political implications of the thesis. So, which is to say, I mean, let me put it to you as a simple question, which is actually a difficult one, and that is something like, what's the relationship between the migration that you describe and the future of democracy?
Let's take this back to what this particular migration, to use a singular word, migration, to describe such a large phenomenon seems a bit cheeky. But what I'm talking about is the successor to what happened in North America and Europe and Australasia between around the time of the French Revolution to around the time of the First World War, which was a dramatic and sometimes violent and very disruptive population shift, of course. We had the move to commercial agriculture in Europe involved clearing out common lands. It involved the various horrors of the Irish famine and so on, which were very much a political event of forced urbanization and so on. But, mind you, that did end lethal poverty as a phenomenon of the Western world. And then there was a bit of a break as the two world wars and the Great Depression took place. Not a complete break, there were human movements. But something else began after the Second World War, mainly when the process of decolonization began in many parts of the world. And you started to see, probably the first places were in South America, mainly in the Middle East. And as those very formal structures broke down, you started to get the movement of people, partly because infrastructure was built. There was a huge building of infrastructure in the 1950s that allowed people to move. Turkey urbanized mainly because there were roads and there hadn't been before. And after 1973, there was a bridge across the Bosphorus and so on. And during that period when you had very nationalist governments of various sorts in the developing world, it was kept to a certain level. You had a type of politics which often valorized peasant agriculture, and both a Marxist version of it at its most extreme in China, and, but also versions of it in places like Brazil and so on, which tried to prevent that urbanization, but allowed it to a certain extent because you had these nationalist, often state-owned or protectionist-maintained industrial manufacturing centers in the cities, which had large-scale need for people to move in. It created an elite class of manufacturing labor, and a lot of people came in for that. And that was when the first of these neighborhoods started to form, often very quickly and dramatically. And this existed at a certain point until the crises of the late 70s and 1980s began, when these closed national economies began to be unsustainable and the economic logic of them stopped working. You started to have hyperinflation, huge public finance crises, and really in India, in Brazil, in many parts of the Middle East, all at once in the 1980s. And this resulted in a lot of this sort of imposed economy falling apart and being supplanted by an informal economy in these places. An economy based on hustle and barter and low-level entrepreneurship and international commerce and so on. And that transition was very dramatic and happened at the very worst possible time, really, at a moment when you had all these people who'd moved in expectation of this very closed circle of elite jobs. And suddenly you had a state that could not support their neighborhoods, that either through its bankruptcy from these crises or from the conditions imposed in the bailouts from those bankruptcies were not able or allowed to spend on these sort of transitional neighborhoods. And that is the reason why so much of the developing world was so violent in the 1980s and early 1990s in South America and sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and so on. And throughout the 1990s and the last decade, you started to see the congealing of some of these new middle classes. Sometimes that word is a bit tenuous, of at least stable working classes in the arrival city neighborhoods of places like Turkey and Brazil and some parts of India. You also started to see the formation of very large settlements within China, which are officially non-existent in certain ways. China prevents the formation of actual urban citizenship among rural migrants to a large extent. But these places actually have, in some cases, brought about a sort of democratic stability during the past 10 or 15 years. I think a lot of the reason why most of South America has gone from being extremely volatile and revolutionary and prone to military takeovers, as has Turkey, to being a place where parties stay in power for their full terms and are reasonably well elected and stable, is because now you have the franchise of these fairly solidly developed and reasonably stable districts where people are not likely to be thrown out and bulldozed and so on.
Well, except in China.
Except China is a very special case, and of course it's the largest case in the world. So the question is, if that stability, and Bangladesh as well, it's actually had an elected government for the last 2 years now, after periods of volatility. You could tenuously say that it's beginning to have that, although I wouldn't bet the farm on it either. Still, this stability of the arrival city, if I can call it that, has covered a surprising amount of the world. And I would give this low-level stuff credit, because I wouldn't say that that multinational companies are bringing about stability in these countries. I'd say that a lot of grassroots stuff is helping as well. Now, China, I'd say China is playing a bit of a Ponzi game with its migrant neighborhoods, in the sense that it's not allowing the 200 million people living with 1 foot in the city and 1 foot in the village to become permanent urban residents. Officially, it claims to have liberalized these laws, but if you see how it actually works, there's no way to get your kids in school in these cities. There's no way to collect a pension or anything like this. So these guys have to keep 1 foot in the village, keep their parents and their children in the village, and see their children once a year. The social effects of this number of people is incredible. And one of the large reasons why is because the Chinese peasant working in the city, it relies entirely on savings. The village is sort of a forced savings account, but bank savings are a huge part of it, because there's no pension, there's no health insurance for them. Bank savings are all you've got, and they save hugely. And the savings of peasants in these banks are the main source of capital for the Chinese state-supported industries. And you have this sort of circuit of finance in which, if you actually permanently urbanize people, this high savings rate might fall apart, and it would cause an economic bankruptcy for the firms that support them and so on. I think there's a real fear of allowing that sort of stability to take place. Also, it could lead to democracy. You could get a tension, because you get tensions in the world between the old nationalist middle classes, who are the beneficiaries of these old state-controlled or benefited industries, and the new hustle and bustle middle class of the arrival city. And these tensions are terrible, right? I mean, in Egypt, that tension could palpably be said to have caused Al-Qaeda to become popular. Muhammad Atta, for example, was the child of extremely disillusioned parents who had worked in these state industries and who had felt disenfranchised as the arrival city middle class became the wealthy middle class of Cairo and so on, and these people were left in the dumps. The anger of the Maharashtrian Hindus of Mumbai at having lost their elite positions in these industries were a large part of how the Shiv Sena movements and so on developed. So